This week on the Herbal Hour podcast, we have a special treat. Brynn Anderson is with us. She is a herbalist and maker of Vital Force herbs. So she's here today along with me to teach you guys how to use herbs better and how to be a better herbalist. So we're going to talk about the Western system of herbalism, how to pick the right herb for yourself, and some of the regulations and legal implications of being an herbalist. And we kind of come from different traditions because you did the apprenticeship kind of model of herbalism, whereas I went to naturopathic medical school and I'm doing herbalism under that degree. So I want to talk a little bit about our different experiences. But yeah, so if you're trying to be a better herbalist, you're trying to learn how to use herbs better, this is the podcast for you. And it is called the Herbal Hour. So it's about time we did an episode dedicated just really to herbs. So to start off, for people who haven't seen the past episodes we did, what's kind of your background? How did you become an herbalist? What inspired you originally?
Well, I mean, I always take that story all the way back to childhood, but I won't make it long today. So definitely started, early on with my mother and grandmother in the garden. That was definitely my first inspiration. And, making pots full of sand and flour, soup, brew, magic potion with friends and all that. And then really as a teenager is when I kind of started really, just reading about it. Somebody gave me the Rodale's Illustrated Dictionary of Herbs, I think when I was about 14 or 15, and the very first natural food store co-op opened in my hometown. So those kind of went together. When I walked in the store and I was like, whoa, what are all these little bottles? I love these little bottles. What's in them? Oh, what? There's herbs in here? So that was just kind of instant excitement. And then I moved to Eugene, Oregon, which was a pretty exciting hotbed of herbalism there. It seemed like, within a few weeks of moving there, it was like everybody I knew was making this, that, or the other, going to Wildcraft this or that, or, so I quickly just made friends and dove into learning how to, make my first salve, make my first tincture, harvest my first, roots, going out on identification walks and all of that. So it was really a lot of self-study for a long time. And just, I had a friend who was in an official herbal school, which I was in different schooling at that time. I was in preschool teacher schooling. So I would go over and help her study, which helping her study, like she was doing flashcards and illustrations and all these things. And so I ended up learning just as much as she did because I was the one who was quizzing her and helping her, make everything. So we did that. And then really having children was the next step where I wanted to raise my kids with herbs and also wanted to do it right and not mess it up. If my child had a fever or something, I wanted to feel confident that I could help them through that situation with natural medicine and, feel confident about it. So really just, self-study for a long time. And then the end of my journey, I guess, then was to finally decide, okay, I want to go to school for this. I want to start a company. And so then I joined the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. And that is mainly an online program, but a very intense online program that requires a lot of like plant meditation and, doing a lot of things. I also, at the same time, joined Rosemary Gladstar's Science and Art of Herbalism program. And then there was some in-person workshops and things that I did with the School of Evolutionary Herbalism as well. So kind of did that. And then I did an internship at the herb shop in Portland over on Mississippi, which was awesome. And that just really got my hands in it every day. Just it's kind of another angle, the making of medicine, but also just the commerce and kind of all that stuff behind it. And started my business as well.
And that brings up a good kind of jumping in point for somebody who's looking to take the herbalist path a little bit more seriously, or really just wants to learn more so that they can use them for use herbs for their kids, loved ones, for themselves, so that they don't always have to be reliant on a doctor, or especially pharmaceuticals, which obviously, as we know, have they're very strong and potent, and they're single ingredients. So for that reason, they can also have a lot of side effects. Personally, I'm not like completely against pharmaceuticals, but I think they have like a time and a place. Same with herbs.
Yeah.
So on that subject, I want to talk a little bit about some of the different paths that people can get into learning about herbalism. You brought up one, the School of Evolutionary Herbalism. I personally really like Matthew Wood and his books, like the Earthwise Herbal and Traditional Practice of Herbal Medicine. I think it's backwards on the camera, but
No,
he has
actually,
like online programs that are. It is okay, perfect.
Yep.
Love his system of herbalism because he teaches from the standpoint of the ancient traditions and herbal energetics, which we're going to talk a little bit about today for people who are interested. So that's like, those are like two ways that you can go about self-studying. But then of course there's programs that you can go to. There's like online and not online, like in-person ones. And then an alternate route, which is kind of the route that I ended up taking, was to go to naturopathic medical school and then kind of do herbalism under that, because we learned a decent amount about herbalism within the program. But I think that, so I was talking to someone who is an herbalist who also apprenticed like you, but she's interested in following like a nurse degree or something like that as a way to get kind of in front of people, because obviously herbalism is the Wild West, because it's not really regulated. And for anyone who's like, how do I become an herbalist? Do I need to go to some like school? No, you can be an herbalist today, actually. You just need to follow certain kind of legal rules. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the things you need to keep in mind when you're trying to actually be an herbalist?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still going to say that it's important to have some, I'm going to call it education, but it's not, I mean, it's good to have your hands on, first of all, the plants themselves. I think that's really important, is that direct plant-person communication. And also there's so many great resources, whether it be through books, online, in person, all those different programs, or just another person who's educated and can, you know, kind of, you can apprentice with or just learn from. That's all super helpful, I think, in just kind of getting you going on your path. Some of the things, I guess, to look for is, I mean, you need to know your plants. If you are going to be making medicine for other people, you need to know what plants you're working with. Now, the School of Evolutionary Herbalism is also very much based on Matthew Wood's work. It's not based on Matthew Wood's work, but his work is a huge part of it. We go through all the energetics, which we can talk about more later. But a lot of it is just individuating the herbs and people. That not that, you know, chamomile isn't the herb for every single person, or, you know, willow isn't the herb for every single person, because every single person's different. You know, so that's, I feel like, something that's really important. And there are some schools of thought that don't really take that into consideration. And so, I mean, it kind of, you know, there's many paths for sure. But I think it's good to know your plants. Obviously, you don't want to give someone a poisonous plant. So you need to know your plant ID, and you need to know your harvesting practices. If you're out wildcrafting, about, you know, where's safe to harvest from, where's clean to harvest from, where you're not over harvesting from, all of those things. If you're buying herbs from people, you know, where are those herbs coming from, and all that kind of. So there's a lot of homework involved, I feel like, for sure. Even if you don't go to school, there's a lot of homework if you are going to be, you know, a competent herbalist who, you know, is going to make medicine that works. And also you need to believe in yourself. And sometimes you have to take a lot of risks and go out on a limb and mess a lot of stuff up and be willing to throw things away that didn't work out. And, you know, this batch went moldy and this batch tastes awful. And I thought these two things went together, and actually they really don't. So, you know, there's a lot of creativity and trial and error and all that stuff that goes into it as well.
I'd say it's definitely a better time to be an herbalist than it ever has been, just because I remember Matthew Wood telling stories of kind of, you know, 10, 20 years ago when it really was the Wild West, and, you know, herbalists were getting arrested for trying to practice herbalism, for practicing without a license and all that stuff. Nowadays, it's a little bit, there's a certain kind of path you can follow in terms of doing it in a wise way so that you don't get in legal trouble. And for anyone who's kind of interested in following that path or just knowing the basics, I recommend going to the American Herbalist Guild website. They have fact pages and other information on like what are the rules actually for practicing as an herbalist. So for example, they'll tell you things like you can't say you're treating a condition, you can't, diagnose things, you can't make promises, you kind of have to act more as a kind of consultant, like just giving general recommendations. You can't really give medical advice. There's a lot more specifics in that, but anyone's interested, highly recommend following to that. It also has information on if you want to make your own kind of herbal blends or tinctures. So me and Brynn, we both have tincturing companies. This is an example of one of my tinctures. And there's a lot of kind of good manufacturing practices that you need to follow to not get in trouble with the FDA. Although the FDA is in this weird place where it's not technically supposed to be regulating herbalism. That's why you always see on the back of herbal bottles, like this product is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure anything like that. That's basically just like, don't bother us, FDA. We're not related to you in any way.
Right.
But so far it's pretty, there's a lot of like kind of steps to doing it right. So I highly encourage anybody, if you're trying to be really serious about starting a kind of like herbal company, look into all the legal aspects because there's a lot of them. And while like when you're small, it's fine because no one will notice. But if you ever want to get kind of bigger, like you're going to have the feds at your door if you don't follow the right practices. So that's kind of why I went through the legal route with all the insurance and commercial kitchen and all that kind of stuff, just right from the get-go, although it's really expensive. So definitely be sure that's what you want to do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, following all of that does get, pretty expensive. I was going to say on the American Herbalist Guild website as well, there's also a whole section that lists every school in the States that they know of. So there's a really great database in there that will just, you can look up by state or by program, and it'll tell you in-person programs, online programs, people to apprentice with. Even universities like, where you can actually go get a bachelor's of herbal studies, whatever level you're wanting to go to, that's a great database there. And also for just, learning how to make simple things, learning herbs is a great, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but they're a great resource that have just tons of recipes. They have an online community you can join. I think it's a couple dollars a month, and they'll kind of highlight certain herbs every month. They'll talk about, identification, harvesting, how to make different things, news, surrounding herbs, all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of another similar resource, same as American Herbal Guild.
Yeah, that's a really kind of good start. And I think you'll know if you are really interested in herbs if you're kind of reading one of the herb books and you get really excited and you don't know why.
Yeah.
That's a good sign that you should
and then
really
you
follow
order
that path.
5 more.
Yeah, exactly. So there's probably people who are listening to this who kind of they drink herb teas and this kind of thing. But if herbs interest you, highly recommend at least self-studying. You don't have to be an herbalist professionally, but it's so good to know how to use herbs effectively, because then they can actually be helpful rather than just being kind of, whatever.
Yeah. Well, and something you said too, as far as legalities and how you're not supposed to say what something is for, which can make it really tricky. If you decide, you have a cold or something and you decide to go to, an apothecary or the grocery store even, which, now most stores do carry some tinctures, and you go and you're like, okay, I have these symptoms. And then you're looking and it's very vague. You kind of have to know what you're looking for a little bit. And I think, you're not supposed to say what it treats, but I will say there are a lot of companies that say, kind of
there's a lot of
they'll say
technically illegal practices in the herbal
even
industry.
on the bottles where you're like, wow, are you really supposed to say this is for, this specific thing? But it's a little bit cryptic. So it's nice to know, okay, if I have a cold, these are the things I'm looking for to support my lungs and my sinus and my cough. I don't know how to make them, or I don't want to, or whatever, but now I can go to the store and I can at least read the ingredients and say, okay, this has elderberry in it, or this has eyebright in it, or something, and maybe you can go look it up further. But if you kind of just walk in hoping that a label is going to tell you what you need, it might be a little tricky.
Yes, especially if you go to an herb shop and you kind of just go to the immune support section, there's going to be 20 different herbs that are all said to support immune health, but they're all so different that
Right.
And that's generally how the typical consumer behaves, just because that's how the system is set up, where the herb products can't tell you like exactly what they're for, or even really talk about the history or traditional use as much because of all that legal red tape. So to be a better herbalist or use herbs better, it's better to have that knowledge for yourself, because nobody can stop you from actually knowing what the herb is good for, and then just going and buying that vague specific product, which is just that herb. Also a cool thing. So I think this is a good place to segue and kind of get into actually how to use herbs more effectively. The system of herbal energetics, which comes from Greek medicine, it's really beautiful because it doesn't use the typical Western kinds of diagnosis. So you can practice as an herbalist using that system without actually diagnosing specific conditions. So it kind of gets you out of that legal red tape area, and it gives you a more holistic picture. So I wanted to kind of jump right in of the Western herbal energetic system. Okay, so basically the first step is to get like a book that has the herb functions, and especially one that tells you about the herbal energetics, because they come in very important. So Matthew Wood's approach, which I love, and actually comes from ancient herbalist practices, there's kind of a triad that you're looking at when you're trying to choose which herb is best. So the first thing is the location of the herb effect. That's basically what organ system it affects. So certain herbs, they're specific for different organs or different tissues of the body. Something like milk thistle is a specific for the liver, right? It's very liver protective, helps regenerate the liver, things of that nature. Chamomile is very specific for the nervous system. And what's another good example that you think of when you think of organ specific herbs?
Let's see. Let's say elecampane, although it is traditionally in ancient Greek, in ancient medicine, I guess, was a bitter digestive remedy. I would say now it's generally considered a lung remedy. So
respiratory system.
That would be specific to the respiratory system. Yeah.
Right. So the herbs, they all have this kind of specific action on the body. And this is kind of one of the main parts to understand, because when you try to figure out what herb to use or what herb to give someone, you kind of have to know what system is affected. And then that's where the whole art of herbalism comes in, and where it becomes very interesting. So going through a few other herbs, like rosemary is another specific for the nervous system and the respiratory system to some extent. Ginkgo biloba, really specific for the nervous system, memory, those kind of things. Then you have things like gentian root, which is very strongly specific to the digestive system.
Right. And very, Then we go into the gentian is very different than fennel, which is very different than,
and they're all
chamomile,
specific for the organ system, but they have different effects. So that's kind of just one part of it. And where you get that kind of information is from like an herbal book. It'll tell you what organs is specific for, and also from your own experience. I mean, you might notice that whenever you eat ginger, like it feels like your digestive system is kind of working. You might be like burping and stuff like that. That's how you know it's kind of active. So you'll know, ginger is specific also for the digestive system. The interesting thing with the organ systems is it can affect more than one organ system. So it's not really, black and white where this one herb is for that organ or things like that. So that's one part. So you want to know what organ system you're trying to treat. And the way to know which one to pick is kind of the whole art of medicine in general. It's like, how do you link a symptom that you're having with what organ system is in dysfunction? And that's like a topic for a whole, 3-hour class, just that part.
Well, it is. And yeah, absolutely. Because sometimes too, there's many organ systems and something's on the bottom, and then maybe it hasn't been treated or has gotten worse or complicated for various reasons. And so you're having an issue with your lungs, but really the issue is like 3 steps back somewhere else,
Right.
So there's that to uncover as well.
Yeah, because the organs are obviously in this kind of symbiotic relationship with each other, where if one of them is deficient, then another one suffers. But the original kind of root cause of the issue could stem back into an organ system where it's like not obvious. For example, So I was talking with Dr. Shannon Curtis. She's a naturopathic doctor, and she was kind of filling me in on how to treat skin diseases. This was in the episode, I think it was like 2 weeks ago or something like that.
Okay, yeah, I've seen that.
And so what her point was is that a lot of skin remedies, the way you approach it is actually by treating the liver, because the liver is the main detoxifier in the body. It's the true detoxer. It's not, the fad detoxer. It actually does, break down compounds and help you metabolize and get rid of things that are harmful to the body.
Yeah, it's your main filter for sure. Yeah.
And then that's the idea.
At the end of that. Yep.
Exactly. It's also another organ that helps kind of get rid of toxins out of your body. So just as an example, if somebody has a lot of skin conditions, you might not necessarily treat their skin directly. Like you can, use like a cream or salve just for the kind of local symptoms. But when you want to be kind of great herbalist or really use herbs well, you actually want to treat the root of the issue. So you might treat something like the liver, because once that's in balance, once the hormones are in balance, because the liver is a big part of hormone metabolism as well, and also detoxifying. So once the liver is in balance, then the skin stuff clears up of its own. And that's how you really practice holistic medicine, really in general. It's not, looking at just what the obvious thing that's affected. It's trying to find the reasons why and go deep into the rabbit hole of what's causing things.
Absolutely. And that's what you were saying before about getting away from the diagnosing something. It's not saying, okay, your skin has this, it's eczema. Like, I'm diagnosing this as eczema. You're not doing that. You're looking at the skin and saying, wow, I see an imbalance in the skin. And what I know is that when the skin becomes inflamed or, congested, that means we trace that back to the liver being congested or imbalanced in some way. And so we go back. And so it's like you're following the golden thread of finding, what the root of that is. There's no need to diagnose. Then you work, and there's a little bit of trial and error there. And also finding which, we can get into that with the further down the energetics of which liver herb is then right for that person. And
exactly. Yeah. And it's kind of like holistic diagnosis, I would call it, where it's not, saying in a reductionist way, this is the issue, this is the pathology, it's right there, it's because of this chemical. It's more of looking at the body as patterns. It's more looking at what kind of patterns of dysfunction are happening. All patterns.
So that's not an allopathic approach. It's not linear.
Exactly. And you can use herbs allopathically, as they say. There's this term of green allopathy, which is, it's actually probably the predominant way of using herbs, which is, you go on PubMed, you look up an herb that is for anxiety. So you look up anxiety herbs or something like that. And then you just pick one because the research says it's useful for anxiety. And then you just use it. Use it just like you would use a pharmaceutical, where this is anti-anxiety. That person has that, so I'm going to use this herb. And of course, that doesn't really work that well, because herbs are not necessarily as well targeted, because there are a lot of compounds and they work kind of synergistically, and they don't, in general, force physiological function the way pharmaceuticals do. So something like a benzodiazepine, like Xanax, for example, that's like a direct acting pharmaceutical agent that stops anxiety. It forces it stopped. In fact, it works so well that people become addicted to it, because when they're not using it, their anxiety is like 10 times worse.
Right. And
that's
they have
like a
no
forceful
way
function.
Self-regulating it. Yeah.
Exactly.
I know. And herbs are much different. If you look at skullcap or lemon balm, or even something stronger like valerian or kava kava for something like anxiety. Yeah, if you're expecting a pharmaceutical response, that's not, if you take a lot of skullcap, it will knock you down, but it's not the same, it's such a different thing, because really it's stimulating something within yourself. And sometimes, I think sometimes that can even be not what you expect it to be, as far as like you're calm and suddenly you're calm, and then you're like, what am I really anxious about anyways? And like you're able to process it. I feel like the plant is working with you rather than just stopping it or stuffing it down or ending it, and just like pain. I mean, pain is an intelligent response of the body. Inflammation is an intelligent response of the body. When when you have a fever, in order to, ramp up that temperature, get the white blood cells going, push out the virus or whatever's going on. That's all the intelligence. So when you just take something to stop the fever, you're basically turning off the body and saying, like,
you're working against the
no,
body.
I don't need you to do this. I got it. I'll just take this pill and I'm good. And
Right.
and like you said, there is a time and a place for pharmaceuticals for sure. But there's also ways that you can just work with your body, and then maybe you have that fever, and the elderflower helps even raise it up a degree, and then it helps open your pores, and then you're able to, have that wonderful sweat, and then your body just cooked out whatever was bothering it, and then you feel better, and you're like, wow, okay, and then maybe you feel better than you even did before, because maybe that fever also pushed out some other things that were, brewing for some other reason, under the skin or whatever. So
that's a really key principle, I think, of naturopathic medicine, holistic medicine, or herbalism in general, is to really orient one's mind around how can I help spark the body's healing, or how can I help along the healing process, rather than just attacking or fighting against symptoms, which is typically what most of conventional medicine is based on. And obviously it's really effective at that. But the question is, does it actually lead to long-term health? And when we actually look at it and see people who are on, 10 pharmaceuticals, their health is, worse than if they probably were using none. So it works in a sense because it gets rid of the immediate suffering of the symptom. But as you were saying, which is a super important point, that those symptoms, those things that are unpleasant, are actually part usually of the healing response of the body. So something like a fever is actually something that if it's not too high and dangerous, you actually want to support it, because as you were saying, it increases the immune response, increases white blood cells. It makes, viruses and bacteria harder for them to live because of that elevated temperature. And all of it's an intelligent response. Like even the fact that you get really kind of tired and lethargic when you have a fever, that's not like accidentally. That's actually part of the cytokine release. So your immune cells release certain chemicals, and it actually influences your mind and behavior, because that's what your body wants you to do. It wants you to stay at home, curl up. It doesn't want you to spread around to other people, because
exactly, go lay down and go to bed. Yeah, for sure.
So all of that's part of the intelligent response, and things like pain and all that is an indicator that something's wrong. So I think for people who are interested in using herbs more effectively, or really in holistic medicine in general, that's a key point to understand, is not just looking just at the symptoms, but looking beneath them. Like, what is the body trying to say, and how can I help it? Rather than just, I have a cough, I'll use an anti-cough herb. I have a fever, I'll use an anti-fever herb. That is the same kind of reductionist thinking that pharmaceuticals use, which just doesn't really work for herbs because they're not really strong at that. So it's losing both. You basically get neither of the benefits. You don't get the benefit of the herb or the allopathic method when you mix them up like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also, like, in the example of the fever, if you suppress the fever and then your body doesn't have that root, then sometimes it drives, the condition deeper. It's like, well, okay, I couldn't use the fever, so now I got to, take this root. And then you end up with, an infection. You get bronchitis instead of just having a fever and a cough or something like that. And so I think that's an important thing to look at as well, is how do you support the body in finding that root, and then taking those steps to healing, rather than, when you cut it off, or the pain, you cut off the pain, but then what are the side effects of that? Or what are the long-term kind of things that can happen from suppressing your body's intelligent response? I mean, inflammation is an intelligent response, but of course we know that someone who's chronically inflamed, that's a whole situation in itself, because then you end up with, long-term conditions or cancers or different things that thrive on inflammation. So there's a point where your body's like, okay, I did my thing, but now I need some help getting out of here. Like, I backed myself into a corner. How do I get out of here? And then that's when I think herbs and that holistic view of finding the roots and following the energetics of the body to kind of pull yourself out of that dead end and figure out where to go.
That's
rather than just cutting it all.
One of the main principles that the early naturopaths were very big on is that when you suppress symptoms, you drive diseases into a more chronic form, as you were saying. Yeah, so, and that is not even something theoretical. Like, I can give you an example from the biomedical perspective of where this is true. So people who have like skin conditions or asthma, usually if they're treated from a very young age with corticosteroids. And the way corticosteroids work is they directly stop the inflammatory response. So they help with the symptoms, right? Because steroids naturally in the body, like cortisol and other corticosteroids, they're the body's way of balancing out its inflammatory response so that it doesn't get too far. But when someone from a young age has, asthma or something, or has eczema, and from a young age, they're given these suppressant things, which help with the symptoms, right? Their skin gets better, their asthma gets better. But over a period of time, and this is well documented in the medical literature, people who are treated for asthma, for example, from a young age with these corticosteroid inhalers, later in life, they'll develop, severe eczema, whereas they wouldn't have had it otherwise. So it's like when you suppress one thing in the body, all sorts of weird, unknown side effects happen that might only appear, 10 years later. So that's really important to know, where it's like a quick fix thing, right? The pharmaceutical, it sweeps the dust under the rug, right? So the house looks clean, but eventually the dust builds up and then you start getting sick from the dust.
Picks up the rug.
Yeah, exactly. And eventually it's just like a matter of time. So I think it's really important for people from within this Western tradition to understand that a lot of the deeper philosophical notions of how we treat disease are at issue, not necessarily the tools that we use. So I think that's really important to kind of understand when getting into the path of herbalist.
And I have, just a little personal story of that. My daughter got, she started getting a skin condition, like a rash behind her legs, like where you're kind of like where your leg meets the chair, where you're sitting, she's sitting in a chair at school all day. And I think just, sweat or whatever, having her that area, she started getting a rash, and then it got worse. And, we tried just, like some calendula in the bath and, some various little things. Didn't really do anything. It hurt to put salve on, it burned. So we didn't do that. And then when I ended up taking her to the doctor, of course, they were like, here's some steroid cream. And I was just like, oh, I can't do it. I don't want to do it yet. Like, okay, I have it if I need it, but let's try some other things. And so I went back to that, what we were talking about before, is like, what's going on with the liver? Mm-hmm. What is she eating? What, she definitely has a more sensitive, I feel like, GI than, some of my other children. So I was like, okay, let's look at what she's eating. And we started just doing simple burdock tea and tincture, and which matched her energetics great. It matched so many things in her picture. And burdock is kind of a long, slow, it's a long, deep root. And it's a, it's not like take burdock for 2 days and your skin clears up. It's months. So we spent a good 3 months, with the burdock every single day and doing some baths and different things. And we never used the steroid cream, never took anything else, and it went away, and it's never come back. And that it's not always that easy, for sure. And it's not always like burdock isn't going to work for everyone. As we've been talking about, that things are so individual, but it was a great little success of like, at first, the very first thing is like, okay, stop the symptom, cover it up, do something for the skin. The doctor's like, oh, rash equals steroid cream. Here you go. And then, but just having the knowledge that I do have and thinking back like, okay, wait, no, we need to step back from the skin and go, follow it all the way back to the liver. And sure enough, it worked great. So.
You bring up a good point too, that herbalism is kind of the long game. It's not
for sure.
There are definitely herbs that are very strong and will act suddenly. There's many examples of those, but in general, herbs are more for the longer use, kind of rebalancing the system over the course of weeks, months, even years. There's this idea that, if it took a condition 10 years to become chronic, right? Or somebody's been suffering from the same thing for 10 years, you're not going to be able to fix it overnight. Even with pharmaceuticals, you can only disguise it. Right. So the longer the imbalance has been in place, usually the longer it takes to rebalance it, which is really unfortunate. But I mean, it's like that with all things, right? It's like that with diet and exercise. If you have been eating cupcakes and donuts for like 3 years and now you're 100 pounds overweight, you're not going to be able to lose 100 pounds in a week. Like, you're going to have to do a completely different way of life for months to remedy that. Forever, and it's just probably, like that for herbs when organ systems get out of balance.
It's more of a lifestyle change, and definitely different.
That's where the knowledge comes in, because without the knowledge, you won't have faith in the herbs working, because you might not see the benefit
you'd be like,
at
man,
first.
I gave her burdock twice. Yeah. And it didn't work.
Yeah.
And that is a
So
common
back to
thing
the
to
steroid
say,
cream.
oh, it didn't work.
Right.
Yep. Yeah.
So having the knowledge is great, because as I was saying, it gives you that faith to stick with it, and then you'll see the benefits. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you can pick kind of the right herb that fits all the things. So we talked about one of the things, the organ or the location. That's one of the three main things. The second thing, and this is a wide topic in and of itself, is the herbal energetics. So the herbal energetics, you can read about it, a lot of different herbal books. We'll kind of just briefly mention it. Like you might have seen, oh, that's a hot herb, that's a cold herb, or you might have heard the terms. It comes from Greek medicine. It comes from the elemental theory of disease. So the basic qualities of herbs are hot, cold, dry, and wet, or you can call it damp. Both are right. And the way it works is herbs have these general effects of hot, dry, cold, damp, and conditions can also be hot, cold, dry, and damp. So the basic theory of traditional herbalism is called the Law of Contraries, which is using the opposite herb for the energetics. So if you have a hot condition, you use a cold herb. If you have a cold condition, you use a hot herb. If you have a dry condition, use a damp herb. If you have a damp condition, use a dry herb, etc. So what does that all mean, right? Because that's very theoretical and vague. But just very, very basically, and I'll give you guys some resources for how to look deeper into this system. I'll give a very basic overview, and then you can comment with your experiences. So hot conditions are typically conditions where there's a lot of irritation, there's stimulation. Inflammation is a key indicator of hot conditions. So, if you have like a red rash that's really itchy, that's a hot skin condition. If you have even something like anxiety or irritability is like a hot condition of the nervous system. So everything hot has to do with inflammation, has to do with overstimulation. If you think of heat, it's like, there's too much energy, let's say.
Right. And Matthew Wood calls that heat excitation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like everything's excited, everything is moving quickly, or
Exactly. That's the tissue state. So the tissue state is excitation. So any kind of condition where there's like an overactivity, that's how you can think of hot conditions. There's an overactivity. So let's say somebody has, GERD or a lot of stomach acid. That's like a hot condition of the stomach. I mean, it literally feels hot because it like burns. A lot of times hot conditions will have pain. Typically hot conditions will have pain and inflammation, something like rheumatoid arthritis, where the joints are really like red and swollen and warm to the touch. That's like a archetypal hot condition of the joints and musculoskeletal system. So that's just like a general framework to understand. And for hot conditions, you use cooling herbs. So what do cooling herbs do? They do the exact opposite. They reduce inflammation, they reduce activity. So there's cooling herbs of the nervous system, which are the nervines. So things like passion flower, lavender to some extent, skullcap, peppermint, lemon balm, especially lemon balm. They're all very cooling. And going back to the organ system, they're specific to the nervous system. So they're cooling to the nervous system. So when the nervous system is overexcited, use those herbs specifically for that. On the other hand, you have cold conditions. So cold conditions are characterized by underactivity, literally coolness. In general, chronic conditions are considered cold. The archetypal cold condition is a cold. Like we literally call it a cold. You feel cold, you're weak, you're tired, and this kind of thing. It's actually specifically a cold and damp condition because usually, so damp conditions have a lot of excretions coming out, like mucus, excess liquids coming out, sweating, anything like watery, or even like swelling in the body is a damp condition. And then dry conditions.
Or like a chronic, like a weepy rash. Exactly,
yeah. That would probably be like a hot and damp condition because it's kind of like inflamed and irritated and stuff.
Yeah.
So as far as dry conditions, that's generally something like dry skin is an obvious example. Any any condition where there's like not enough moisture in the body or not enough moisture wherever, that's a dry condition. So something like constipation is a dry condition because you don't have enough fluids to, drive out. Anything that is very, Matthew Wood talks about as being like sclerotic. So anything with like hardening, contracting, so like warts or something like that would be a dry condition because there's kind of like a hardening going on from lack of moisture. And as I was mentioning, you'd use like the opposite herbs. So for a cold condition where, typically these chronic types of conditions, you actually want to use hot herbs that are stimulating. So if somebody has indigestion, you can think of that, especially indigestion from lack of, stomach acids and things like that, or from like a weakened digestive system. You actually use these kind of hot and spicy herbs. And that's exactly how they taste. You taste them, you feel like warm, you feel, like things like cayenne, ginger, cinnamon, all these different things are really warming, specifically for the cold type of conditions. And then as far as the damp conditions, there's actually, I know, there's like two kinds of dampness. I think it's important to make the distinction because they're actually pretty different. So in the body, there's two kinds of dampness that could happen, probably more in fact, but this is just like a simplification. There's damp relaxation. So that's when like the tissues are relaxed and there's a condition of a dampness that just is flowing out. So somebody who's urinating a lot. Yeah. Somebody who has like, like their nose is runny. A lot of things are coming out of the body, like maybe even diarrhea, where like it's damp relaxed because there's like this wetness, dampness in the body, but it's relaxed because it's just like flowing out. And then there's
no tone. Yeah.
Exactly. And then there's damp stagnation. So damp stagnation is the other kind of dampness. That's actually when there's a lot of moisture fluid buildup, but it's trapped. It can't get out. So stuffed nose is like damp stagnation. Swelling, like edema, when somebody's from heart disease, their legs swell or their arms swell or their face swells. That's like fluid being trapped. And the reason why it's important to make that distinction is because you use different herbs based on which kind of dampness it is. So for damp stagnation, you actually use kind of diuretic or clearing herbs. Diuretic literally means it increases urination. So something like if you had, swelling in the body from fluid, something like dandelion root is helpful as a diuretic. And I think dandelion leaf as well specifically helps kind of bring the fluids out, and it is drying in that sense. And then for damp relaxation, you want to do the exact opposite. You want to actually slow down that excess leakage of fluid. So astringents are what you use. Things like green tea, plants like white willow with a lot of tannins in them that you'll know them by like the effect they have on your tongue. Like it has this kind of like drying, constricting, puckering kind of effect. Those are all the kind of astringent herbs. And there's a lot of them. And those ones are specifically used for when there's just like a damp condition that's just kind of flowing out of the body. So damp relaxation. And then as far as the dry conditions, you use damp herbs. So those are herbs like marshmallow root, which kind of lubricate tissues, moisten. So if you have like a sore throat, it's kind of this dry condition usually that people talk about having like a dry mouth, dry, crackly throat. And you use marshmallow root because it kind of coats that part of the body and it helps the body regenerate because it protects those surfaces. So that's an example. So that's like a super general wide overview. There's so much more to talk about with that. And if you're interested in that, check out this book specifically, because this is kind of the underlying philosophy of the energetics and examples. And then this is kind of like one of the books for actually in-depth references of the herbs where it'll tell you the energetics. So that's kind of the second tier. So first you find out which organs affected, then you find out what the energetics of the body are, and you use both of them. Is there anything you'd like to add to that? Very brief
a
interview?
Couple things. I'm trying to, yes. A couple things is one thing that really helped me in learning about the energetics that my teacher taught was to look at the herbs, the condition, and your body as an ecosystem and these different ecosystems. So if you're having a hot condition, so think of, something that's super hot. You've got a brush fire that's like so hot. You don't want to get too close to it. Now put that in your liver, like that hot liver condition. Or you think of like a flowing stream, and then the flowing stream goes off to the side and it turns into this super stagnant, stinky pond, right? And that damp stagnation. So if you can kind of picture that like damp stagnation, now put that in your arthritic knee or in whatever, your stuffy nose. And it just kind of helps lend this picture of like what that looks like and feels like, and like where you would mirror that on the earth. Like, what does a damp, stagnant pond look like and smell like and feel like compared to a flowing stream? So then how do you like get back on course to the flowing stream from the damp pond kind of thing? So
it's this
that's
intuitive
something that
view.
helps me. Yeah, that's something that kind of just helps, like, okay, put that condition and think about it, externally on the earth, and now stick it in your body. What does it look like, feel like, smell like, all those things. I think can just kind of help you make a picture, and sometimes that can really help you figure out what herb is going to help you. Another thing that you brought up was, talking about the using of opposites, that if you have a cool, a cold condition, you want to use a hot herb, or if you have a hot condition, use a cool herb. And I think that generally that is the case. And then there's also the similars, where you might have something that is like, it's a hot condition locally, but overall it's a cooling condition, like body wise, like what you were saying with the dandelion. Like initially you might need to get your kidneys flowing and get rid of some stuff. But if you use the dandelion too long, you're going to end up with a drying condition because you've over dried yourself. So there's sort of like looking at the micro and the macro of like, the local condition and then the whole body condition. And that can get pretty complex, but it just kind of depends on how far down the rabbit hole you want to go. For sure.
Yeah. And it goes down pretty far.
Yeah. And then the other thing you said about, say like arthritis is a generally hot condition, and looking at herbal fads and kind of, the allopathic path of like treat this for that. So, I mean, we've all heard that, turmeric is great for inflammation. Okay, like that's the example that I always hear, and it really sticks with me because it's just a simple, great example about if you have hot arthritis, and maybe you're even a hot kind of person. Maybe you're, a pitta personality, and, and you start taking turmeric every day. Turmeric is like a super, super hot drying herb. So is that actually going to end up helping the inflammation of your arthritis? Is it going to help the inflammation of your personality? So there's some of those things to look at when you're choosing the right herb for somebody, is also like, what's going on. You always want to look at what's going on in the bigger picture, and then how, like, if you have hot arthritis, be careful you're choosing an inflammatory, an herb that's going to treat inflammation that isn't matching that symptom. So.
Right. Yeah. There's a lot of complexity to it. I think of it as a language system for describing how herbs work, and for conditions that lets us think more in terms of patterns and intuitively, instead of thinking in terms of very, very specific things like we do in the Western tradition, which has its obviously benefits, but then it also has, some drawbacks because it's fundamentally not a holistic system.
And that's following nature, to be looking at the patterns and the cycles of things. And I think that ultimately keeps you on track.
Yeah. And it gives you a way to kind of express things that elaborates on other things. So for people who tend to work in terms of patterns, and they see patterns between things, this kind of system is particularly useful for them, because they'll start seeing all the different connections. And typically people, I think, who are into the more alternative holistic naturally tend to be those kind of temperaments or personality types. So for example, you can use the system to describe anything, but the point of describing it is so that you can choose the right herb for it. So something like hyperthyroidism, right? That's like the archetypal hot condition. Because somebody with hyperthyroidism, they have excess thyroid activity. They literally heat up. They're sweating all the time. They just feel hot. They're irritable. Their metabolism is increased. It's literally like all of the hot things all at once. And one of the herbs that's used typically for that is lemon balm. And lemon balm is cooling, So it's right on point with that. And it's also has some specificity for the thyroid. So it's like that's kind of how you would understand how to pick the right herb for whatever's going on. You want to know what like organs affected, what area of the body's affected, the true root cause. And then you have the energetics to kind of give you a way of describing the generalness of the patterns and the symptoms of the body. The third aspect we'll talk about is specifics. That's where like all this like herb book stuff comes in, because that's just like this herb is just good for that, this. And that's usually the only thing that people use. So the beauty of the system is that it brings everything together. It's not, it's not mutually exclusive. It's not you use this system and then you don't use the other. This is just an elaboration that lets you have a more complex understanding of how herbs work, so that you can kind of narrow down and pick the herbs better.
Right. It's kind of like keying out a mushroom or a plant, and you're like, does it have gills or spore or the other one? Forgetting on the mushroom, when you key it out, it's always like, does it have gills or the sponge-like, bottom, or does it have broad leaves, or is it a conifer? Like all that, you're kind of like keying out, but then you're layering it on top of like the herb, the condition, the person, the environment, all those things together.
Yeah, so that's like a super general overview of the energetics. I taught a workshop a few months ago on it. So if you guys are interested, if you send an email to Dr. Dan at ktherbs.com, so it's DOCTOR at ktherbs.com, I'll send you a 7-page PDF of the general energetics, as well as tons of specifics of what herbs are to the energetics and some recipes you can make. And if you're interested, I could send a link to the 3-hour class that I held, which I taught about tincturing and also the whole system of herbal energetics and the things that I talked about kind of briefly. So for anyone who's interested, just send me an email. I'll put the email below if you're watching the YouTube video. And I just kind of want to send that out as a treat for people to kind of get started. I used a lot of Matthew Wood's material to make the stuff, so it's very very useful. It's even stuff that I still use for my own reference.
Yeah, that's very cool. One of the resources I thought of that I'd mentioned before was Learning Herbs, but they put together a great little, just like super quick reference wheel. And so there's an energetic wheel, and it has, you maybe have seen that before.
It has the colors and everything with it too.
Yeah, it has the colors, and it shows, so it's got the hot, cold, wet, dry, and then it's got different conditions and herbs, but it's kind of a nice, not necessarily the only tool I would use, but it's a nice cross-reference, and also just to check if you're on the right path. If you're like, I think I kind of feel like this and this, and then you could look at that and be like, oh yeah, look, those match up there. That would work nicely. Or sometimes it'll even show you other complementary things. Quick references are super useful, especially when you use them along with the herb books and also research, and the more information the better, I feel like, when it comes to actually choosing herbs. And that's when herbs can be kind of miraculous, let's say, where they just seem to work so well, and that's usually because it's stumbled on by accident. But when you know the systems of how things work, then you start thinking of things in terms of patterns and how do you move energies and how do you move patterns. Sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say that taste is another element of that. And that goes with things, but something hot and spicy is usually warming. And something like you mentioned lemon balm for hyperthyroidism, it's very sour, and sour is generally cooling. And so that's a whole other, and they also have a wheel of that. But I think that's just another really simple thing that goes along, is to always taste your herbs and, kind of get a sense for what taste matches what kind of temperature. Because that can really help key you in.
That's a really good point. That's like the way that you would know the quality of an herb without reading a book, because by the taste, you can kind of have an idea for what the energetics are, because everything kind of ties in. So that's the beauty of the holistic system, is it's like kind of like a web, and everything just eventually connects together the more information you have. I actually taught a workshop recently on Ayurveda energetics, where I like combined, or rather kind of talked about herbal energetics, but also how Ayurveda constitutional types like Vata, Pitta, and Kapha relate to them and how those herbs work. So if you're interested in that, reach out to me. I actually, I want to if you're interested, I can send you the video because I thought it was pretty good. I did a good amount of research, and it's a little bit more advanced just because you kind of have to understand herbal energetics because that's what it's comparing itself to. But I think you'd find it awesome. But yeah, that brings in the point of like constitutional types that people have a general tendency towards hot, dry, cold, damp conditions based on what their temperament, personality, body type, etc. So that's even another layer to it.
Another layer.
It's a rabbit hole, like we mentioned.
It really is. It's such a rabbit hole, but it's so helpful if you know, like, someone is cold all the time, and then you're like, well, you know, what are you doing for yourself? And they're like, well, I'm drinking this, peppermint lemon balm tea every single day, 5 times a day. And you're like, wow, that's really cooling. Do you ever add ginger or cinnamon in it? No, you know, so it's like, just make sure you're complimenting yourself, or, you know, even putting in a little bit of a warming. Most herbs are cooling as well. You know, there's sort of, you look at different categories. Most herbs are cooling and drying. There are way less herbs that are moistening, or are, the herbs with a high content of volatile oils are more warming. And then there's the few hot herbs like ginger, turmeric, horseradish, you know, some of those. But yeah, it's good to, I think balancing it is always a safe way to go, you know, especially if you're working with other people and you're not sure of their, you know, or if you're, you know, like you and I, we're both making tinctures and we're not necessarily able to have a 2-hour consult with everyone we're selling a tincture to. And so we're more looking at balancing the energetics of our tincture so that it can meet anyone's needs and be gentle enough. It's not going to be a super hot or super cold formula. It's going to be something that's, you know, balanced in order to meet
exactly
the
kind of
general
like
public.
General tonics with tried and true common herbs. Nothing, you know, none of those low dose herbs or anything like that. And yeah, that's the benefit of actually seeing an herbalist as opposed to trying to do it yourself. It's hard. I mean, even if you have herbalism training, it's hard to diagnose yourself because we have a lot of blind spots. So it's they even say like doctors should never treat themselves just because like they don't actually see themselves as they are. Because we have a lot of our own like beliefs and opinions, and like we think we are one way, but somebody who looks at us objectively will be like, "You're not like that at all." So it's useful to see, you know, professional help if you or become a professional yourself and treat yourself and try it and see if it works. Maybe it works. I don't know.
Well, and something I want to that makes me think of just what we were talking about earlier, that really anyone can be an herbalist, and it's kind of a gray area, which has a lot of blessings to it. There's a lot of freedom in that it isn't super regulated, but also at the same time you want to do your homework about an herbal practitioner that you choose, and you want to make sure. I saw a little story about this today, that someone was had kind of had an interaction with a fairly new herbalist who was really condescending and very much like, you have to do it this way. I know how to do this. You're wrong. You want to make sure that you're getting a feeling sense of who you're working with, and that you jive with them, and that you feel like you trust them, and that if they already know everything about you, that might not be the best person to work with. You know, that you want to find someone who is open and who listens well, and who isn't ever like shaming you, or, you know what I mean? Like you want to, so just like you would with a doctor. I mean, you want to make sure you find somebody that works well with you, and remember that you're like, I think I've been hearing this more and more, that you are hiring your doctor. And I think it's definitely flipped in our society, that it's like, my doctor told me to, I have to do this because my doctor said so. My doctor's so, you know, I mean, I've known a lot of people that don't like their doctor at all. But I've been hearing more and more. It's like, wait, you hired your doctor. If you don't like your doctor, you can fire your doctor and find one that you like. And I think that goes true with any practitioner, is just to make sure that you're on the same page and you're comfortable with them and you feel like they do know what they're talking about, or, you know.
That's the issue with the conventional medical system, is that that's pretty typical, that people, just because their insurance covers it, you know, they'll go to that doctor that they don't like. Just because somebody's a doctor herbalist doesn't mean they're a good person or that they even care about you. Unfortunately, there's no like guarantee. And in the sphere of healing, that aspect, the compassion and being a good person, is actually very important to the healing process. And it's kind of forgotten. So if you have any interest in kind of the more holistic paths, I highly recommend you find a practitioner that vibes well with you. And even if you have to pay out of pocket, it's going to be worth it in the long run. You might be getting free crappy service through your insurance, but like, it's the same thing as like, oh, well, I just go to the mechanic who pretty much messes up my car every time I go, but it's free. So might as well, right? It's like, no, spend a couple $100s and get your car fixed. So
right.
that's,
and then you don't have
just
to
my
use all
plug.
that time to keep going back. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's absolutely true. And it's unfortunate because I think that that's really, I mean, that's like you said, that's a huge part of healing. It's not about what herb you take or what pharmaceutical you take. It's about that connection with another human who has decided to be a vehicle for your healing process. I don't think a doctor or an herbalist fixes you. I think that ultimately you heal yourself, and it's about them helping you find that path. Or, I mean, I always feel like, you know, I'm connecting an herb with a person, and that's, you know, I'm like the intermediary between the person and the herb or formula that they're looking for, ultimately to stimulate their own healing inside of them. And if you go to someone and you don't feel open to talking, or they're like, do you sleep enough at night, do you smoke, do you do these things, and you feel like, oh yes, I sleep great, I really only sleep 3 hours a night, but yeah, no, I really sleep 8 hours, and no, I don't smoke or do any, you know, like, if you're not honest, if you don't feel like you
really
can be
want to
honest
get
with that
into it, because
person,
it's like, what are they going to do anyway to help you?
yeah. Or if they ask you like, well, when did this start? I mean, and that's something, I mean, that's like basic training of what I learned is when you're working with a client, in order to find the source, whether it be a rash or, you know, any kind of chronic condition, it's like, well, when did this start? And if you want to be comfortable with the person to be able to say, well, you know, it started right after my mom died, or it started right after I got in that accident, or something simple. It started right after, you know, Thanksgiving. You know, well, what happened at Thanksgiving? And you know, it's like you kind of go down the rabbit hole with a person. And so really, I feel like there's this, like, you see a doctor for physical conditions, and you see a psychologist for mental conditions, and you see
Everything's
a
boxed
counselor
off.
for emotional. It's all boxed off, and we are not boxed off. We're
not. We're,
multidimensional, multifaceted people. And so I think you
we have to
have
be
to, I
treated
think,
like that.
right. And physical conditions most always have an emotional root or some kind of component. And so if you can go to someone that trust, and even if it's your friend herbalist, you know, if you don't want to work on yourself, then maybe you can trade. Like, hey, can you check out my lungs and I'll check out your headache? You know, maybe get a more honest answer than if you're trying to treat your own self. But anyways, you get the picture what I'm saying.
There's this beautiful quote by Paracelsus that I think about a lot. He says, the physician treats, but nature heals. Alternatively, he also says nature is the best medicine. And other quotes along that line where it's the fundamental relationship of the healer to the person is they're kind of like a guide to that person's healing. That's why this, what they call the therapeutic alliance between practitioner and client or patient is really important. There's a ton of research showing that if people trust their doctor better, if people have a better relationship with them, they have better results no matter what they do, even if they give them the same herb or the same pharmaceutical. So the aspect of the relationship with the doctor is very important. And it's also very important to know that not everyone jives together. Like, somebody could be a great doctor or a great herbalist, but like the personality might just not work well, and there's not like that level of trust. So like, it's no shame on either person, but it won't work in the long run. So I think it takes a really honest practitioner to be like, you know, like, I don't think that I can be of best help to you, but I maybe know who can. And I think that's a very honest way to do it. Unfortunately, in the holistic spheres, everyone is so desperate to survive that like that rarely happens. But, you know, whatever. I'm just trying to be ideal.
I'm gonna figure it out. That is the ideal.
And with the insurance model, you know, you see your doctor for 10 minutes. So it doesn't matter how holistically minded your MD is. If they don't have more than 10 minutes, like, they can't really ask you the kind of questions to know how to really treat the cause. So
basic herbal consult is 2 hours to start to really like dive in and kind of get, you know, and I know just from, you know, taking my kids to to NUNM that, if I go for a wellness check at their pediatrician, it's 10 minutes top. Once a year, 10 minutes. Like, okay, yeah, you grew a little bit. Yep, cool. All right, next. And we go there and it's like 2 hours, which the first time we did that, my kids were like, what is going on? Why is this taking so long? But it was very involved, and it was every facet of life. It wasn't just like, okay, your reflexes work, your throat looks good, you grew, great. It was, how's school? How's homework? Do you feel stressed? How do you sleep at night? All those things. Do you get along with your siblings? It was a much more holistic picture of how that child is growing and where they are each year in their growth versus just the 10-minute, like, all right, you're still standing, next. So different model for sure.
That's a thing that I really love about naturopathic medicine, is that in general, practitioners will take that extra time, but at the end of the day, they can still give a pharmaceutical if it's needed in certain cases. So it's kind of like the best of both worlds in a lot of senses. So I really hope the profession keeps, flourishing and gets licensed in more states. Because right now it's only about licensed in half of the states as like a doctor or physician. Yeah.
Okay.
In Oregon here, it's like naturopaths can pretty much do everything. They just can't do like serious surgery, and they can't prescribe like chemotherapies and some intense psychiatric drugs and things like that. But otherwise they can do anything else that a regular doctor would do. So it's good to have that in your tool set, even though that's like not my focus. It's good to have that as an ability, even though I prefer to use herbs first, because I just think they're much more gentle. But yeah, so the final aspect of herbs, and this is kind of, I'll just say very generally, because there's not much to be said without getting in extreme depth into a lot of herbs. The third part of this tripod, let's call it. So we got the organ system now. We know where the disease is located, and we got the energetics. We know the overall condition. The third thing is the specifics. So the specifics, this term came from the eclectic physicians of the late 1800s and early 1900s. These people were MDs, they were medical doctors, but they were very holistically minded. So they used a lot more herbs, they used minerals, that kind of thing. They're kind of the prototypical naturopathic doctor. They're like earlier, they're an earlier tradition than naturopathy. So we obviously take a lot of influence from them. But they developed this intense system. And if you ever want to look into it, go on henriette'sherbals.com. I don't know if you are familiar with that website.
Oh, yeah.
You are, of course.
Yeah, definitely.
So they have their Materia Medicas of the eclectics from like 1898, 1905, whatever, like Felter's and other ones. You'll see it on the website, Henriette's Herbals, or just look up eclectic. But they have this intense system of herbal specifics where, the specifics of an herb are what general symptom picture does the herb go along with? What is the general presenting issues that the person will have, which dictates what herb would be good for them? So on those pieces of research, and even in books like this that you can reference the specifics, it'll say things like blah, blah, blah herb is really good for people who feel like this, and their skin looks like this, and their heart rate is like this, and their pulse is like this, and they have this symptom and that symptom. And it gives you this whole wide picture of what the herb is good for, where going to that point of that you were talking about, where the herb is seen almost as like a personality, and it like matches with somebody perfectly. And that's where all the symptom picture things come in above the energetics and the location. So I'll give you like an example. So let's say somebody has an issue with their liver, and it's a hot issue with their liver. So it's like inflammatory and infectious. But the specifics are they have vomiting and diarrhea, and they have yellow skin, and maybe they have a rapid heart rate. And then, there's like a specific herb that would work really well for that. Maybe something like burdock root or milk thistle. I don't know the exact specifics for that one, but that's a really good resource to look into to give extreme depth. And I think with those three things, and then maybe you can even throw in like PubMed research to like validate if the herbs are actually what they're used for traditionally, and if they're actually shown to work. 'Cause there's, of course, as with all traditions that are passed down, like there are going to be some things that are true and some that are not. And it's really hard to pin them apart. That's why I think research is still actually useful. Unfortunately, and not to get too far into this, but research in terms of herbs is usually done, what I would say, in an incorrect way. So it doesn't show the results that it needs to, because they don't take into account the energetics and the organ system and all that. They take into account, they have the Western diagnosis of anxiety, and we're going to give these supposed anti-anxiety herbs. And it's like, it doesn't work like that. So no wonder the research shows that it doesn't work.
Right.
Although
and they're like, that
it shows it works a lot of the time. So research is good in like
or then they take
convincing proof.
Sure. Or then they take it and then try to do what happens with pharmaceuticals, like for turmeric. They'll take it and like, it was curcumin is the active part of turmeric that helps with the inflammatory response. So therefore, we're going to concentrate that. Right. So now you should look for a turmeric supplement that's 95% curcumin.
Yeah.
But I feel like that's taking away from the original intelligence of the plant. Like, what about the other 95% of the compounds that are in that plant that are working with your body in a way that didn't show up in the experiment? That's, not shown. So
exactly. It's like the same philosophy and methodology that's used for conventional medicine is applied to herbalism. And then it works sometimes, and other times it doesn't work at all, which is kind of problematic. Sometimes when I'm choosing an herb, I like to go through this kind of process. Like, first I'll kind of look at the traditional uses, or like I'll have like a general condition, let's say like indigestion or something, and I'll look up what are the traditional herbs that are used for that. Okay, I'll have like a list. Then I'll look up PubMed, like which herbs have actually, there's studies that people with like indigestion or any kind of gut complaints have actually really helped most of them with. And I'll kind of look at that list and compare it. And then I'll have like a kind of a prototype of some of the herbs that could be helpful. And then you start getting into what's the organ system of the person, the specifics and the energetics. And by then you should have like 1 or 2 herbs that would be good. And I prefer to take the high dose herbalism route, like 5-10 grams of a lot of these herbs. I don't, that's just kind of the tradition I studied in. I know there's some people like Matthew Wood who use a lot more like drop dosing, where they'll put a few drops of tincture in a glass of water.
Yeah, they'll be like, What
do you think about that, by the way? What's your approach to that? Because that's like a kind of contentious topic within herbalism.
Oh, it is. I mean, and it's so funny. And it's so, I mean, you could go to any of the, more well-known herbalists, and every single one of them has
a different view.
Kind of take on it. Yeah. Matthew Wood's like, I gave somebody a really high dose of lavender. I used 10 drops, and that's like, whoa. And somebody else is like, what? Four dropperfuls at least. You got to do that to, and so I think it depends. I think sometimes it's also individual. I think it deals with people's sensitivities. I think that someone who isn't as sensitive, maybe someone who has been on a lot of pharmaceuticals and is looking for that kind of big response, I think, maybe for them, they might feel like they need the 4 dropperfuls. I think someone like Matthew Wood is more attuned to the subtle energetics and how the 3 drops of lavender is affecting that person as a whole on a spiritual, energetic level.
The homeopathy kind of
background. And I was going to say all what you were saying about the eclectics is all very similar to homeopathy, like painting that picture. Like there's one red cheek, they're grumpy from 2 to 4 a.m. There's only pain on the right side. I mean, there's kind of all like putting that whole picture together. That's really similar with homeopathy. And then you look at if you're going to, purchase a tincture, one of the like Herb Farm or Gaia or something that's one of the more mainstream brands at the store, and it says 633 milligrams per serving or something, and then you're like, well, this one says 800 and this one says 600, so how many dropperfuls do I really need to take to this? I think it's especially with yourself, I think it's really good to play around and experiment and start with the lower dose and see, like, can I take 3 drops of this? How do I feel? Let me try 6 drops. Let me try 25. And the same goes if you're working with a client. I mean, you kind of have to, I think you need to just make a decision really and figure out, well, if I want, especially when you're dealing with a client and you're wanting compliance, you're like, I'm really hoping to get enough burdock, to whatever, just to get into their system, especially over this long period of time. So let's go ahead and say 1 dropperful 3 times a day. And then even if you're looking at like 50% compliance, like, they always forget to take it at dinner or something, and then at least some was in there, So I think you kind of just have to make a decision on who you're working with or whether you're working with yourself, and then go with that. And if it doesn't work, then you take away some or, add more, in whatever, safety degree there is.
I think of it as a kind of journey. And I think Chinese medicine, herbalism is very inspiring in that sense, because the typical approach is like, you'll see your herbalist every week over the course of months, right? And every week, depending on, so they'll give you a formula after you tell them generally what's going on. Then when you come back the next week, you tell the herbalist like what you noticed, what helped, what didn't, everything that's changed, and they'll alter the formula. And then they'll do the same thing next week, and then the next week, and then the next week. So it's like a kind of journey of like, when you're working with these patterns and energies, there's a lot of like fine tuning that has to happen, because there's no like cure for anything within this system. There's like a way of balancing out the energies, and you could get it on your first try if you're lucky, or it might be your 10th try. But like, it'll happen eventually, probably, if you stick with it. So it's about the journey of it. But what you bring up with the compliance thing, I think that's super important. If you're an herbalist, like, and the person's coming to see you for the first time, you want them to have a noticeable effect, because it's very likely that if they don't notice some benefit right away, they're going to just drop it and be like, and lose faith. Because while the herbalist may know, oh, this generally takes 4 weeks to work, a person who doesn't see benefit from taking a tincture for a week will be like, it probably just doesn't work. And that's actually a lot of naturopathic doctors. They have this theory where it's kind of interesting. I don't exactly know how I feel about it. I guess I'll see when I'm in practice more. They'll like sometimes just give Band-Aid pharmaceuticals just to like deal with the symptom immediately. And then when you come back, we'll start dealing with the roots. But like, just to give the faith and the trust of like, I know what I'm doing. I can help you. We can do it this way. This isn't the best way, but it works. And I've actually heard that that's pretty effective, that when somebody comes in and they have an annoying symptom and they want to get rid of it, you just kind of almost compromise and say, okay, well, fine, we'll do this for a week, but when you come back, we're going to work on the herbs and diet, and eventually we're going to move this pharmaceutical out. And that tends to work better than being very like, dogmatic, like pharmaceuticals are the devil and like you can never use them. And, like it's just unrealistic, because people in the West expect instant results. It's a weird place.
Yeah, I mean,
like I said, I don't know how I feel about it.
Trained and programmed and brought up that way, that, that results should be expected immediately. And if it doesn't work today, then throw it away and get a new one, So throw away your herbalist, get a new one. It didn't work. But and that's something, that I always learned in my herb school too, was that there may be this whole picture you figured out and you go down this golden thread of some, whatever that root is, but you still want to treat the primary complaint. Like if they have this horrific cough, but even down the road, you trace it to some, whatever happened emotionally. If you're just like, okay, well, I'm going to give you some lemon balm for your emotions, but then this like horrible cough isn't going away, then they're not going to, have that faith and confidence that you know what you're doing. So it's best to treat the primary complaint first. And then, and that kind of brings me back to something you were saying, we were talking about chronic conditions and, that things take a long time, that you might be taking a herb for weeks or months, is that sometimes as you're unraveling, you're going to kind of go back through those things. Like first the last complaint you had was the rash. So first the rash might disappear, but then the next thing is going to come up, which was the thing that appeared before the rash. And then that's going to go. And then it's going to be the thing that appeared before that. So you're kind of going in that like Matryoshka doll reverse order. As you heal from the root, you've got to go backwards to the source as well. So yeah.
It's a key point. It's part of the reason why I like to use higher dose herbs, just because for people who are not familiar with how herbs work, it gives them the immediate benefit so that they generate a little bit of faith, and then we can work on the deeper, more subtle aspects. For example, something like ginger. If somebody has nausea and you give them like a good dose of ginger, like it's almost guaranteed that it'll help. But if you give too little dose, maybe it won't. Maybe it'll work if you give it for a week at a lower dose. So there's a lot. It's an art, really. It's an art. There's no right answer. The only right answer is what works. And what works is hard to pin down because of how individual everyone is and how different approaches are and the quality of the herbs, the concentration of the compounds. what else is going on in their life. If they're taking pharmaceuticals. There's just so many factors that it's really impossible to get it right on the first time every time.
Yeah. And I think, that's something you can do in your questioning of someone is just talking about their sensitivity, like how, just kind of finding out in general how sensitive someone is, like I feel personally like I feel like I take higher doses myself, but my partner, he's so sensitive. It'll be like, whoa, man, I took a vitamin C. Holy cow. Like I could clean the whole house. Like that so energized me. And I'm like, what? So, or like, oh, I had this little bit of chamomile tea. Like I'm sacked out on the couch in 5 minutes. And for me, I'm like, wait, how did that work for you? So it just also depends on that individual sensitivity. If you're super sensitive to things, then you don't need the higher dose. And if you're someone that's like, even if it's someone who typically does take, they're like, I take Advil every single day for my arthritic knee. And maybe they've requested, I'd really like to get off the Advil. It's hurting my stomach. I want to do, or ibuprofen. I'll say I won't use a brand name, but, then you got to be like, well, how many do you take a day? Oh, I need 6 in order to feel anything. Then you're thinking like, okay, we're going to work with some higher dose herbs. If you're taking 6 ibuprofen a day, you're not maybe going to feel 4 drops of whatever, maybe they are though. I don't know. That's the other thing is it could be totally contradictory to what you think it is. So
I think it's different theories that kind of overlap because when you're using low dose herbs, you're functioning, I think more of the homeopathic area of healing where it's like, you're not trying to create necessarily a physiological response with the herb, but you're trying to have the body counterbalance it. So that's where the idea of the law of similars as opposed to the law of contraries. The law of similars is you treat like with like. That's the fundamental tenet of homeopathy. And it works also with herbs. Like, I'll give you an example of this. It's, using somebody has like a fever, but they're having a hard time breaking the fever. So you actually give them like ginger because ginger is really heating. Fever is really hot. You're actually trying to increase the fever. You're trying to make it more effective. And then that makes the fever break and it makes the person get better because you're kind of helping along their system. So instead of giving a cold herb for that condition to reduce the fever, you might give a warm or hot herb to stimulate the fever more. So that's like a completely fundamentally different approach. And if you're doing different doses of herbs, I think that's where that comes in, where you might not want to give a lot of ginger just because you don't want to really heat them up so much because they're already in a really hot state, but you might want to just give them a little bit so that when it affects their body will have a counter response. Like their body will overall have a cooling response to what you gave them. And then that'll help them with their fever naturally.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's just as important to learn the law of similars as, the law of opposites.
Well, they both act like herbs don't care what box we put them in. Like they just do what they do. Well, they just do what they do. Like we put boxes on them, but those boxes are just theoretical.
They are, and they're very movable. And that's like in Ayurveda, that term prabhava, about the, that special potency of that herb that doesn't fit in any of the boxes. It's like skullcap is skullcap because it does what skullcap does best. And it may be a certain constituent, a certain function. It may be, whatever, but it's
that's like the specifics of that tripod.
And sometimes it's a specific that doesn't fit in any of the boxes. It's just it kind of stands alone on its own. So
like going back to ginger, that's a perfect example of one of the specifics of it. Although it is like generally supportive to the digestive system, it's unique because it specifically really helps for nausea. Like it really helps for nausea. Whereas other digestive herbs like chamomile, fennel, gentian, they may or not help with nausea. It depends on what the cause of it is. But ginger that's just what ginger does. And that's like the element of knowing what the specifics of the herbs are. And if that's a really worthy place to study deeply, because the specifics are kind of like just what works and like not caring about the mechanisms or the whys. Of course, you can never get as deep as is possible without knowing the energetics and the locations and the physiology and the underlying causes. But if you're just looking for like something to just work, the specifics are the quickest way
and
to that.
That's just how it is.
Sometimes that's enough. I mean,
short term.
Yeah. And if you're not a professional herbalist, maybe you just, you have some issue and you want to work with it. Just look up the eclectic book or like a book like this and just find the herb that works. And that's it. You don't have to be like a professional to use herbs. I mean, animals use herbs in nature to heal themselves all the time, and they do it instinctually. So that's a whole nother aspect of herbalism, is the intuitive, instinctual aspect of it, which definitely still exists within us.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you ask the question, like, how did people figure out what herbs, like, where did that all come from? That's a whole other episode on its own.
Yeah.
There is that intuitive where we had to, figure that out with the plants themselves.
Yeah.
Which is super important.
I think we still have that, especially when we use herbs like frequently and develop a relationship with them. Like, let's say you drink chamomile tea pretty often. You kind of have a general sense for what chamomile does. And when you're feeling a certain type of way, you might like actually crave it. You might be like, oh, chamomile would be perfect right now. And that's like the instinctual, the more experience you have personally with using the herbs, the more you actually truly understand their energetics and how they work, and the better you can apply them to other people. Because if you know generally how it works, then you'll notice those same symptoms in someone else and you'll be like, oh, this is the perfect herb for them. I just know because I used it and it worked perfectly for this.
Right. Yep. I think that is very true.
All right. So to end off, I wanted to talk a little bit about our sponsor, which is actually my company, and some of our new products. So we were talking a little bit about detox. This is Dionysian Detox. And this one's got milk thistle, dandelion root, artichoke, and burdock root. It's flavored with ginger, orange peel, and raw honey. This is an alcohol extract. Me and Brynn both make alcohol tinctures. And obviously the reason that we use alcohol is because it's very good at pulling out the essential oils, the fat soluble things, and the water soluble things like polysaccharides and mushrooms, for example. So it pulls out the most of these elements. Really like this blend for just general detoxing. As I was talking about the liver being a main force of detoxification, that blend is really good for supporting the liver generally. So that's one of the new blends that came out. Then this one's Apollo's Light. I don't know if you can see it.
You have to get a little, there you go. Now I can see it, cognitive support.
Yeah, so this one is kind of the nootropic blends that I formulated. So you might notice some of the herbs in it, ginkgo, gotu kola, green tea, rosemary. So ginkgo, obviously, there's some research that it improves blood flow to the brain and helps with memory through that mechanism. Green tea, of course, everyone knows green tea helps with the mind and focus. Gotu kola is a classic in Ayurveda for supporting the minds. And then we got rosemary, which is specific for memory. There's something that Shakespeare says where it's like rosemary is the herb of remembrance or something like that. So there's an old tradition of rosemary being really good for that. Then we got this one, which is, I don't know if you can see it. It's called Demeters Bitters. And then this one is a bitters formula. So I don't know if you have a bitters formula for your company, but let's see how ours compare if you do. So this one is... I
have a digestive that's, Go ahead, this one,
the fundamental ingredient in it is really gentian root, which is a digestive bitter. So what those do is they stimulate kind of gastric secretions, they move the digestive system, and that bitter flavor stimulates the gut through the vagus nerve. So it's anything with like a bitter taste usually stimulates digestive function, like bitter leafy greens, those kind of things are really good.
Yeah, right, from when you taste it.
And then this blend is actually hybrid extract. So I don't know if you make any of these. So I use part organic vegetable glycerin and part alcohol for it. Because obviously gentian is so bitter that it's like that kind of bitter that goes on the back of your tongue and makes you just like for 30 minutes. But because
it makes you like shiver.
Yeah, it's so bitter. It's like that. You ever like take like a pill or like a pharmaceutical and it like slid on your tongue on the way back, and then it's like that bitter on the back? That's kind of what gentian is like, that's why it's so effective. But I think I did a pretty good job of disguising the flavor of it because I added peppermint, orange peel, ginger, fennel, and cloves, which are other warming digestive stimulants. And altogether, it's just a little bit bitter, but then it's kind of sweet and yummy afterwards. So it's like a Trojan horse formula. It's like a way to get the digestive bitter into you without like being so disgusting, because I was experimenting around with different formulations of this, and I like even chewed a little piece of gentian root, and oh my God, like a little section of it was just like,
wow, that was brave.
Like, yeah, it was rough. It was rough. I tasted the deep bitter in the back of my tongue
though, right?
for like 30 minutes.
Important to know that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I noticed my stomach kind of like gurgling and burping and all those signs that, you know, the digestion is getting
exactly. But to take it back to the beginning, we were talking about that's super important to like know what that's like. How does that make your body feel? Like if you take a taste of gentian root, you know, that you just read all the books right there.
Yeah. I hope people who are making digestive bitters, like for other companies, they actually taste it before they give it to people. Cause goddamn, if I only put the gentian root and didn't disguise it, it would have been just like,
it would have
taken a real like hardcore herbalist to deal with it. It would be really effective.
Yeah.
But like it would be something that most people would not be able to handle, especially people who taste the odd herb and they're like this tastes weird, or kids. Oh my God.
Yeah.
There's no way that they
Mine is Genevieve's Gentle Belly, and it's definitely a more mild formula. It doesn't have gentian in it, and it's fennel and catmint and chamomile based, and with a few other things in there. So I
like it. What's the catnip in there for?
Catnip is actually a traditional digestive.
Really?
And then also and also helps with that kind of nervous stomach.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like.
So it can be really, really calming for someone who has indigestion or something, because they're, you know, feeling antsy or nervous. It can really bring that down, and then allow the other herbs to kind of work on the, you know, the actual
and
the juices and all those things.
And this formula, Demeters Bitters, it really works in a kind of different way. It doesn't work on as much of that kind of like nervous system stomach. It works more on just like stimulating digestion, getting the juices flowing, getting everything moving. So actually those two formulas would go well complementary together, I think.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I kind of do that. You know, I have two different sleep tinctures. One of them is more for just like a super restful sleep, and my other one is a dream formula. But I was taking them separately, and then I decided to start taking them together, and I actually really love taking them together because I feel like I get active dreaming, but I also feel super rested. And so I'm like, well, I could combine those into one, but then I feel like that kind of muddies it when you end up having too many herbs in one formula. So I don't know. And then you can, if you're like, no, actually, I just want to sleep tonight, I'm not really interested in remembering my dreams or whatever, I'm just going to go with this one. So I think it's kind of fun to have multiple formulas for various areas.
And it shows the kind of principles of herbalism that we were talking about, where there's a lot of different kinds of digestive support formulas that you could have, and they're based on different causes. So like this one's particularly really good for people that have a lot of bloating, cramps, any kind of like sluggish digestion. They feel like indigestion. They just need everything to move. They feel like it's overall sluggish. Whereas the kind of formula that you made is more for somebody who has like a nervous stomach, or they have their anxiety has a large part in their digestion. Things like chamomile, lemon balm are really good for that specific one. So it's like a different cause of indigestion.
Different layers. Yeah. Different kinds of digestion, different kinds of sleep, different kinds of headaches. I mean, that's the thing is,
and the cool thing about these three formulas that I just talked about and made, they're not as much for kind of specific issues like I made before, meaning that they're kind of just supportive in general, because the idea of using digestive bitters before you eat just stimulates anyone's digestion. You don't necessarily have to have issues with digestion. It just helps you get more nutrition, helps it function better, helps everything just move more smoothly. Then everyone can use more memory. And then the detox, I mean, who couldn't use detox right now with how many chemicals and stuff we have? And so these are just general supportive formulas, even for people without necessarily conditions. So you guys can check them out at ktherbs.com and use the code family for 25% off. Those are the three new formulas. And where can people check out your products?
I am at vitalforceherbs.com. So I have all my formulas on there. It's page 2 of my website is the list, and I have tinctures and salves and some elixirs and other fun things on there. Some random things like sunscreen and fun stuff like that. So I have a couple little I don't have any tinctures with me. I have a little, these are the tiniest. These are like my little things that are in my purse. So I don't even know if you'll be able to see them, but basically my label's black and gold. So there's little Vital Force herbs. This is currently called Rhea's Rash and Deep Skincare, but I'm actually working on kind of switching up the formula and the name a little bit. It is a cottonwood bud based formula, which I felt was really helpful for some of those deeper, like, weepy eczema and things. But I think it's also more, I can show you, actually, I don't know if you'll be able to see with your camera, but I was telling you a few weeks ago, I got bashed by a cedar brand.
Mm-hmm.
And I had 5 stitches right here, and I've been putting this cottonwood bud salve on, and just like within 5 days of getting my stitches out, it's almost completely healed. So I'm feeling pretty stoked on this blend right now.
That's awesome.
And then I have Minerva's Muscle Meltdown, which is my pain salve, which is kind of like an herbal take on icy hot, like if you think of I don't know, my grandma always had this huge tub of icy hot. I was like, what is that stuff? I don't know. But it's an arnica base, but then also has ginger and spearmint for kind of that heating and cooling element.
Nice.
And calendula and Devil's Club, which I put Devil's Club in this small batch, but I'm moving away from that because it's such a specific remedy and only found in these Northwest forests. And so I wasn't feeling like I wanted to use it in a product that I was going to be making in a mass quantity. So I'm taking that out of the formula. I have a few left of the special Devil's Club edition. And then let's see, I have a little lip balm. This is Lakshmi's lip balm, which is just, pretty fun, basic calendula, comfrey, self-heal, and lemon balm and chamomile blend. Yeah. I'm really getting into self-heal. It's something that popped up in my yard. It pops up in everybody's yards. It's got it's a non-volatile oil mint family. It grows just right above the grass level with little purple flowers. It doesn't have a scent, but really amazing skin herbs. So. Yeah, there's
awesome.
Some of those.
And that's a perfect place to insert the announcement. So me and Brynn, we're doing a kind of partnership where she's going to be making some skin products, salves, that kind of thing for Kentaurus Therapeutics. So stay tuned at ktherbs.com to see that, and also on her website, Vital Force Herbs. So we'll be unleashing that within the next few months. She's quite adept at making creams and salves, so that's kind of the reasoning. I'm more of the kind of formulation tinctures guy.
Into the formulas. Yeah. As I was telling you, salves were like the very first thing I ever learned how to make. And just having my whole house fill up with the smell of like the simmering herbs and the oil and then the beeswax is just like, that's pretty much like the most heavenly smell to me. So I could do that all day, every day for sure.
Yeah. And it's good too, because a lot of these skincare products, they suck, right? They have a lot of chemicals in them. Like, why are you putting chemicals and going in your body? And it's like that same.
Then your liver has to deal with.
Yeah, it's like, oh yeah, it'll make the blemish go away, but you're putting poison on you. Like,
yeah.
So
yeah, and that's really underregulated. Like, we have ingredients on our food, and you can generally, the ingredients are on your shampoo bottle or your cream bottle, but I feel like it's a little bit harder to find out about or to know. You're like,
there is different regulations. There's more stringent regulations on things that people ingest versus what they put on their skin. Like the things you can put on your skin that are legally allowed to be put in products are just crazy. The things that you ingest, they have to go through much more stringent manufacturing processes. So if you're going to use skincare products, definitely use all the kind of more natural stuff. I mean, it makes so much more sense.
It does. And even, with marketing, they can kind of attach on to like, oh, there was bad press about, say, parabens, and all the natural people are putting paraben free. So then, a company that has a bunch of chemicals might still say paraben free. But then you turn around and it's like, oh, but there's 85 other chemicals in there. So it's just good. A really good resource for that is the EWG. It's the Environmental Working Group, and it's called Skin Deep. And they have a database of every single cosmetic compound that, pretty much that there is, as far as I know. And you can just type that in, and it'll tell you where it comes from, what it's made from. And then kind of they give like a grading system. I think it's like 1 through 5, 1 being like either no harm or they haven't found any evidence. And then all the way up to 5, like causes cancer tomorrow, kind of like super intense. So anyway, that's a cool resource if you want to look at skincare things, to just kind of see like what's actually, in your lotion or whatever you're using.
Yeah, there's a certain brand, which I won't mention, but it sounds a lot like Avena, because Avena sativa, so milky oats.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Uh-huh.
And of course, milky oats is really good for the skin, like doing like oat baths, and it's very like moisturizing. It's really kind of damp in the sense that it builds up the body. But this brand, like, it just has that in it, but it has a lot of other chemicals in it. So there's a lot of like fad type of things where they'll just say like, oh, has rosemary. And it's like, but the rest of the things are like sodium lauryl glyphosate, like these crazy chemicals. But but it has rosemary. But it has rosemary. It must be good.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna go the natural route,
an interesting thing.
Go full natural. Don't go in between. And check out Brynn's products, which will be sold under Kintaro. So
right on.
Any final things of guidance that you would give to people who are seeking to become better herbalists or use herbs better? Any general tips?
I guess I think probably the most important thing that I learned from my schooling and fellow herbalists and from the forest and the plants themselves is that an herbalist is always a student of nature. And that's something that you always, beyond your books, beyond your studies, beyond all those things, is to keep that direct connection, to get out of the city into the woods. Even if you can't get out of the city, go sit next to your favorite tree at the park and just remember that you're part of the same thing outside of this, this thing we call the human world and all of our constructs that we put on it. And I think that is where we find true healing. And that's where we become instruments of medicine when we're able to really connect with that source, which even all pharmaceuticals, we could talk about that. They all came from plants originally. And so just really connecting with that source, I think, helps you become a better herbalist, because it connects you in a way that nothing else can. And then you can also back it up. You can take your intuition and what you found sitting under that tree, and then if you're not sure, then you can go back it up with your book reading. And I just think it's important to have all facets of that, and to just always be a student. And that's the other thing, is to be humble. And to know that, as much as you can learn, you can always learn more. And I know that, it was said to me, and I just always remember this. So I'm just repeating it. But the herbalist Paul Bergner, I'm sure you're familiar with him. He had a little course. I think it was at one of the the herb conferences, the one that used to happen in the fall that was on the NUNM campus. And anyways, it was like a workshop, and it said like how to become a master herbalist in 30 years or more. And that's always just so stuck with me, is that's so true. Like, you can call yourself a master, whatever, you can, have 5 doctor degrees, you can read 1,000 books, but you're always still a student, and you can always be learning, and there's always something new. And the plants are your greatest teachers. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And I would definitely reiterate what you said about to be an herbalist in the fullest sense is a kind of way of life. And it's a way of life along with nature, because these are the forces that herbalists are working with. So if you could have a chance to, go around your local neighborhood and identify plants and harvest plants for yourself and make things from them, there's a much deeper connection, and it's much more powerful medicine, I think, when you work with the herbs directly, because you can only learn so much from a book. Like, you really, to know more, you really got to get out there and get your hands kind of literally dirty with the,
for sure.
with the herbal
or even
world.
Taste that gentian root,
Exactly. You gotta take one for the team.
Yep, absolutely. For sure. Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. I hope this was useful. The episode was really an attempt to kind of transmit some good information for people who want to be herbalist or learn more. So I hope it was helpful for you guys. If you like this podcast, please, if you're watching us on YouTube, subscribe. And if you're listening on iTunes, I know we have a very big iTunes base. Give us an honest review. I'm not going to ask you to give a 5-star review, but it would be nice.
Give an honest review.
Maybe a comment. It helps a lot with the algorithm so that more people can hear this stuff. It's very hard for kind of startup podcasts to get any kinds of listeners just because there's literally a million podcasts. So if you like this one, you want to see more, and please, support by commenting, liking, subscribing. And we're going to be doing a lot of upgrades coming in the future in terms of video and mics to be, right now kind of homemade, but that is only for now.
Hey.
So stick around.
Homemade where it starts.
And a ton of episodes in the past, probably weeks before this, are some of the best ones we've had. So definitely check them out. We're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, also known as iTunes, Stitcher, you name it, we're on there. So
all the platforms.
Thank you. We had Brynn Anderson. She is the best, and she's an herbalist, as am I. So
right.
I'll leave you with that.
Everybody, take care.